May it please the court. I would like to thank the ladies and gentlemen for serving on today's jury. Thank you. One man entering the store and approaching the counter while another man stands by the front door. Sounds like a perfect setup for a robbery. But seconds later, a life was taken. This is a case about murder. Mr. Johnny Hudson murdered Sarah Lazar during the middle of the day in her own store in front of her husband. Mr. Hudson must be held accountable. The state of Florida is able to prove to the exclusion of and beyond every reasonable doubt that the defendant, Ms. Lazar, was killed by Johnny Hudson. The state has proven Mr. Hudson is guilty of first-degree felony murder because 1, Sarah Lazar is in fact dead. 2, the death occurred as a consequence of Mr. Hudson attempting to commit armed robbery. And 3, Mr. Hudson was the person who actually killed Sarah Lazar. While considering the evidence that was presented today, the instructions require you to decide what evidence is reliable and for you to use your common sense in deciding which is the best evidence. The best evidence will show Mr. Hudson is guilty of first-degree felony murder. Today, the state presented evidence that the defendant, Mr. Hudson, entered the Lazar clothing store and approached the counter. He then pulled out a gun and demanded money at the same time. After Mr. Hudson fired the shot that killed Mrs. Lazar, the second defendant that was standing at the front door yelled, quote, "Let's get out of here, Johnny." As previously stated, the state of Florida, while weighing the evidence, requires that you use your common sense. It's widely held common sense that if someone calls your name, you will either react or respond. Mr. Hudson reacted. Mr. Hudson reacted by running out of the store after he heard his name was called and instructed to, "Let's get out of here, Johnny." Everyone has common sense. Common sense does not require scientific data, expertise, or even background knowledge. Common sense simply means 1 + 1 = 2. For example, Mr. Hudson pulled out a gun. 1. Next, there was a dead body with a bullet to the head. 2. Therefore, that equals that Mr. Hudson fired the gun that he pulled out of his pocket. It's common sense. An individual that responds or reacts when their name is called is beyond a reasonable doubt that that is in fact their name. Johnny's name was called. Johnny heard his name called, and Johnny reacted by running out of the store. You have heard testimony of eyewitness identification. In deciding how much weight to give this testimony, you may consider various factors mentioned in the instructions concerning credibility of witnesses. A couple of those factors to consider are: 1, the capacity and opportunity of the eyewitness to observe the offender based upon the length of time for observation and the conditions at the time of the observation, including lighting and distance. 2, whether the witness seemed to have an opportunity to see and know the things which he testified. And 3, lapse of time between the event and the identification. The state's witness, Mr. Lazar, was able to affirmably identify that the defendant who shot his wife was Mr. Hudson. He was standing beside his wife at the time of her murder. Mrs. Lazar was murdered at 3:15 p.m. during the middle of the day inside a well-lit clothing store. Mr. Lazar watched two men enter the store and also watch one man stand at the front door while the first man continued to approach the counter. Mr. Lazar even verbally engaged Mr. Hudson and asked him, quote, "What can I do for you today?" Therefore, Mr. Lazar's testimony demonstrates that what he observed was accurate because he was physically present and even verbally spoke to Mr. Hudson as he was entering his store. Furthermore, there is no better witness to testify and recount the moments and the seconds leading up to his wife's murder besides her widowed husband that was standing directly beside her when she was murdered. Although Mr. Lazar was unable to affirmatively state any unusual characteristics, facial characteristics about the defendant, the totality of the circumstances, watching your spouse being murdered, it is reasonable that a widow will be unable to see any distinct characteristics in a moment like that. Moreover, Mr. Lazar identified Mr. Hudson as the shooter who killed his wife the day the murder occurred. Generally, a person can remember things they did within the same week with some sort of accuracy and maybe missing a few minor details. However, almost every person is able to recall exactly what they did within 24 hours. For example, recalling every meal you ate, every establishment you went to, and every conversation with each person you encountered during that day. If a person is able to recall with detail the events that occurred within 24 hours, from 3:15 p.m. to later the same day, that evening, that's a small window of time lapse between the shooting that occurred and the identification of Mr. Hudson. Thus, it is undeniably reasonable that Mr. Lazar's identification of Mr. Hudson is accurate, because he identified Mr. Hudson as the shooter the same day. So today, the state asks for one thing: that you find Mr. Hudson guilty of first-degree murder of Ms. Lazar. Thank you.